This episode of the Zelos podcast is sponsored by Perform Better. Perform Better is the leader in functional training by supplying innovative products and top-notch education to trainers, coaches, and therapists. Check out the brand new Perform Better app, designed for professionals who want to stay on top of their game. This free app features education from the world's best. You'll learn from industry leaders including Mike Boyle, Gray Cook, Sue Falzoni, Charlie Weingroff, and many more. Topics range from strength and conditioning, program design, nutrition, business, and marketing. Just go to performbetter.com. Welcome back to another episode of the Zelos podcast. I'm Rocky Snyder. In the house with me is Nick Shedd. He is the overseer of all strength and conditioning for the entire Houston Astros baseball program. That just doesn't include the majors. It includes the minors, the AAA, the AA, the farm teams, the Dominican teams, everything. This guy has got his hands over the crystal ball of strength and conditioning when it comes to Major League Baseball with the Astros organization. So Nick, hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me. I'm looking forward to jumping into the conversation.
Yeah, now, dude, you just landed this gig not too long ago, and it's like they put you in front of the entire buffet table at a Princess Cruise Line. It's like there's everything to choose from here, and you've got one team and another. Like, could you just quickly go over all the teams that you oversee when it comes to strength conditioning?
Yeah, so that involves our major league team in Houston, our AAA team in Sugar Land, Texas, our AA team in Corpus Christi, Texas, our high A team in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina, our low A team in Fayetteville, North Carolina, our two complex league teams or rookie ball teams here in West Palm, and then our Dominican Academy in the DR.
Dang. You know, the only thing that seems comparable to that would be like British Premier League soccer. Like they've got so many teams under them, or they're borrowing players from different teams and so on. How do you you must have to keep track of it all in some kind of organized fashion. Is that something that is daunting, or is it kind of like, I'm just going to take it as it goes?
It's daunting if you let it be. So my staff members have been really, really good with my onboarding in the last month and a half, and taken on a lot of the load and responsibility of keeping me informed about what's going on, and for scheduling purposes, programming purposes for different players, injuries, etc. Jumping in during a COVID time spring training was a pretty hectic time to jump in. So I had to delegate, and my staff members really just took on that responsibility without me even asking, and did a really good job onboarding me and keeping me straight.
And I imagine for you personally, this is going to involve a bit of traveling from one team to the other, even with travel restrictions or COVID. Is that part of your job description?
Yeah, so I'll go to Houston and all of the affiliates in the DR, hopefully 2 times a year, COVID permitting.
Yeah, and you mentioned spring training being, COVID tainted. How is it different this year compared to years previous to COVID?
I can't answer that entirely because I haven't been a part of previous spring trainings, but we were very limited on the number of players that could be in the facility at one time. So everybody had to come in waves. So you would probably have 8 to 10 waves of players coming through the facility throughout the day, and they have to show up, warm up, do their on-field work, do their conditioning, do their lifting. So it's a lot scheduling wise to make sure we're rotating players through and abiding by those COVID guidelines. That also created a bigger separation between major league spring training and minor league spring training. So major league spring training that started in February is now, we've now gone through major league, minor league, and now we're moving into extended spring training throughout this month. And we're basically getting to the point where it's not even spring anymore. So it's just going to be training at that point. And then just a lot of COVID testing in the facility, the mask mandates and all of that kind of stuff. It alters how food is delivered to the players. You can't have buffet style foods. It's got to be individually packaged foods, and a lot of nuances around that. And our athletic training staff and front office and dietitians handle a lot of that.
Gotcha. So with this like preseason or spring training, what are your go-to lifts? What are the fundamental, the foundations of programs that you're putting together for these players?
That's going to depend on the player's ability and what level they're at. Just from a broad spectrum angle, lower body force development is obviously important. That's important in every sport. We do all of the general lifts, trap bar, deadlift, squat, that kind of stuff. It's the only nuances there are as throwing and hitting are ramping up. That creates a lot more volume in terms of rotation through the lumbar spine. So going into season, I personally am not as keen on axial loading when we can avoid it. I think it just comes down to exercise selection. But just starting off with general strength, you have to have the understanding that this wasn't a normal off season either. Players typically go home to different countries, different parts of the US throughout the off season, and especially the minor league players that haven't been able to play in a year and a half or so. They've had an extended time away from the team. And depending on where they are, that can impact their access to gym equipment, to the ability to practice their hitting and pitching, et cetera. So you kind of have to take a general approach early on in spring training, build their work capacity up, build their strength up, and then get more specific from there.
You mentioned that you try to kind of minimize axial loading as you get into the season. Do you do rotational loading then? Like, are you incorporating some type of ground-based movement where you are loaded, but you're actually rotating around the axis, such as transverse plane motions more because the rotational nature of the sport?
Oh, of course. I'm more or less talking about, when I say reducing axial loading, not putting compressive forces on the spine. And that's something that I took away from working with the US women's national team in field hockey, which is also an asymmetrical rotational sport. Just creates a lot of lumbar instability, and you're basically combating that all season long. And when it comes to programming, it's important that we're not emotionally tied to our programs or to our exercises. And we always have to be able to ask the question of do we need this exercise? Can we achieve the same stimulus another way? That being said, again, similar to working with the women's national team, where we had the inaugural season of the Hockey Pro League, which is essentially a 6-month season, not unlike baseball, that's half of the year. So if you've got players signed for a 5-year contract and you're only actually developing them in the off season, you're only developing them for 2.5 years. And so my approach is certainly to do everything you can to continue having them get better in season. And that's not being dismissive in any way of the thing that's going to make them the best at playing baseball is actually playing baseball.
Sure. So you mentioned, of course, that it is a one-sided sport or one directional kind of rotational power development, force development. So how do you offset that? Because like you say, axial loading, the bilateral symmetrical kind of movements are not necessarily going to dampen it. If anything, it's probably going to add compensatory patterns if they already have some sign of torsion in their body due to that ability to rotate with power only in one direction. So how do you mitigate that, or at least dampen the effects of it?
Well, I think that's a loaded question. It becomes a individualized approach. With pitchers, you can see acute postural changes from when they throw to the next day, and those things can naturally correct themselves over the next following couple of days, or you can use a little bit more specificity in their exercise programming. When it comes to the rotational aspect in general, that's always going to be a part of the athlete's programming. There's not many sports where I think it shouldn't be, aside from maybe track athlete, which I've never coached track athletes. So um, typically it's a unilateral approach, but equal volume on both sides. That being said, if we get into the conversation around corrective exercise, if you really want to correct a movement pattern, or you really want to increase somebody's mobility or stability in a certain position, I think the approach of just micro dosing it into a warm up or just micro dosing it between sets is not typically very effective. Adaptation requires certain levels of volume and intensity to achieve, and that's no different for corrective exercises in general. So if you have a really serious rotational issue with an athlete, that might mean that you're dialing back other aspects of the program to fix it.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. It's kind of refreshing to hear that kind of approach, because the push to correctives is either we do that at the beginning or in between sets, in the hopes that it's going to restore some type of balance function or mobility, and so that the next load is going to be that much more effective. When I got to agree, I don't think that's the way in which we need to do it. We got to kind of look at what the weak link in the chain is, and can we bring that into a more fortified position so the entire chain is stronger. So you mentioned unilateral loading, and that you're going to do the same volume on each side. So therefore, you're only going to do the amount that, I'll say weaker for lack of a better term, but the side that does not produce as much force as the other side. You're saying you're going to cater to that level of strength on both sides regardless?
Typically, the differences that we see from an asymmetrical standpoint or that I should say I have seen in rotational sports, aren't typically such bad problems that they're actually problematic dysfunctions. There's a big difference between a sport adaptation, which is going to help performance, and a dysfunctional problem. And sometimes those dysfunctional problems are only exacerbated or only present when an athlete is doing something in the weight room that they can't do. But when they go and play their sport, it's not a problem. So then again, you have to, that's the balance between injury prevention and identifying risk factors before they happen. It's not always an easy thing to do, because there's always going to be outliers from those equations or those mindsets. But generally speaking, the sport adaptations are not so exacerbated that it's going to affect programming that much.
I gotcha. So when it comes to periodizing programs for so many athletes and still trying to maintain individuality within the programs themselves based on the athlete, how does that work? That's got to be one hell of a hard equation to figure out. I mean, I imagine you're periodizing obviously through the season because you want your players to peak at the right time or maintain a certain level. I won't even say peak, but maintain a heightened level of performance for as long as you can. So how does that work? And is it different on the different levels of the teams in which you're overseeing? Like if you're talking rookie ball, are they going to be having different programs than the guys in the majors who know what's working for them and they've been playing long enough to tell you, here's what I want, here's what I don't want?
Yes and no. So all models are wrong, but some are useful. And it's important as an organization that we have a model based on principles that we believe in place. And that model is going to drive what buckets players get put into. And that's not necessarily based on what level of baseball performance they are in. It's more based off of physical performance, biological age, training age, etc. So you might see a guy at low A that's doing a similar type of training to a guy that's at the MLB level. That being said, there typically is a pretty big age gap, with the exception of a few outliers, between the rookie ball teams and the guys are at the major league level. So that inherently lends itself to differences in programming. That being said, when you have a certain model, you're putting constraints on players that are never going to apply to the population as a whole. So you have to be adaptable and agile with your programming. You have to allow the S&C coaches that are working hands-on with each of those individual athletes to have the autonomy to step outside of the model, step outside of those boxes, because at the end of the day, our number one KPI is to win. And what produces winning is basically guys hitting balls harder and throwing balls harder, et cetera. It's the on-field performance, which goes back to player development. And if a player is stalling in the current model regarding their development, then you have to be willing to step outside of that.
That's a lot. That's a lot to be contending with. Now, we've got so many things that are kind of, I would say, hyping up right now. And I think I want to get to some of them. Like, there's so many forums out there discussing shin angle, knees over toes. There's a whole group of guys that are going gung-ho. And of course, when you get one concept, they go to the nth degree, and that pendulum swings so far that now there's knees trying to touch the toes or touch the floor with the feet flat and all that. And people are just trying to prove the point. How do you read through the hype? What are you believing in when it comes to different things that are out there right now? And what are you just putting off to the side and going, okay, we'll wait and see how that all filters out? Is there anything there right now?
Again, that goes back to what is the ultimate goal? Ultimate goal is to win. Players have to be the best at their sport, in order to win. So that means that as a strength and conditioning coach, we have to develop the skills and the outputs that are directly going to underpin the on-field skill execution. And so when it comes to all of these different concepts, you mentioned knees over toes, talking a lot about shin angles, et cetera. All of that stuff is applicable in some realm, but I think anything done in extreme goes back to the previous statement that I made, that all models are wrong and some are useful. You have to be able to, I think, have range and breadth, and that's going to lend itself towards problem solving. And it's been said a million times before, but if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You've got to have a big toolbox when you're working in a complex environment like this. I wouldn't say that I subscribe to any one particular model or mentality of training. I do believe that force production generally underpins a lot of athletic qualities. I think aerobic capacity in most sports is pretty relevant, if not for on-field performance, but for recovery performance or recovery capabilities. And from there, it's just dissecting the problems.
Okay, a great answer. Now, I'm very much into gait mechanics, as well as the importance that the role of the foot plays in generating power through the whole kinematic sequence or kinetic chain. I had Tom House on not too long ago, within the last year. We're talking about, basically stepping off the mound to deliver a pitch is an exaggeration of gait mechanics, and you're landing on a ground that's lower than when you're leaving it. And to understand gait mechanics, he's got it down to truly a science, where based on how long it takes for that foot to plant, he could tell you everything that's going on with a pitcher. So I bring that up because I'm wondering, the foot seems like it's the final frontier. It's the area that in strength conditioning we haven't explored up until recently. And how does foot mechanics and the gait mechanics play into strength and conditioning programs and how you're getting your athletes trained, or does it at all? Are you addressing that?
Yes. So in the weight room, I'll give you an example for a lunge. This is a highly debated topic. Should your knee go past your toe when you do a lunge? And my opinion is yes, unless you have a patellar tendinopathy issue. Reason is when you are in an acceleration position, that's going to be highly prevalent, and the weight distribution on your foot should be as such. All that being said, we went through a phase in the history of physical training in the 80s where everything became about isolation. And when this topic of foot mechanics came back up, it feels a little bit more like that conversation around isolation. I think most exercises, if coached correctly, which is a different conversation in and of itself, if most exercises are coached correctly, then your contact with the ground, maintaining your arches, adequate dorsiflexion, etc., all of that stuff should be getting trained at the same time. You can get into conversations about should you wear shoes, should you not wear shoes, where does the actual standardization of a lot of our lifts come from? Is it relevant to the sports that we play? And that's where you start to dabble into specificity.
Yeah, well, that's great. We're both drinking tea here, and we got the knees over the toes in common as well. So we'll just keep on going with that. In terms of specificity and training, my tripping point is understanding where we got our lifts from to begin with. They came from competitions of bodybuilding, powerlifting, and Olympic lifting. The lifts didn't generate because a baseball player went into a gym and began lifting to be a better baseball player. We are picking from 3 different competitive events and trying to fit it into the sport in which we're coaching. So where's the disconnect, or where is the connection? How do you choose from certain movements and say, okay, this is what we're going to do now, and this is why?
So force application and the use of the stretch shortening cycle is direction specific. And we've also seen in the research lately that I saw Adam Virgil did a study recently looking at limb asymmetry measurements, and found that is also very task specific. So somebody might have a preferred limb for one task and not for another. And that is sort of the linchpin, or the question for me is everything that we do becomes task specific when we enter that conversation around transferability. If we're looking at a back squat, for example, squatting below parallel, that came from powerlifting because you have to standardize the depth of somebody's squat somehow. There's a handful of powerlifters out there that believe that you should always have a vertical shin angle with everything you do in order to maximize the verticality, the verticalness of your shin. That often requires substantial external rotation at the hips. That might not be good for somebody, for certain people based on their anthropometry. So you have to look at how an athlete is actually developing force and developing power. And then you also have to look at what's actually applicable to the sport. I don't care that my athletes don't squat past parallel when they are under load. I think everybody should have the ability to sit all the way down to the ground in a squat position. But even in top end sprinting, max speed sprinting, you're looking at a hip flexion angle of about 80 degrees or so. It being in excess of 90 degrees of hip flexion under load is typically not relevant to sport. A lot of the same conversations go around bench press. The positions that you get into to bench press the most weight are potentially not the best positions for an athlete to train themselves into if they want to promote spine neutrality, if they want to promote thoracic rotation and things like that. So again, we have to go back to where are these standards coming from. And when it comes to specificity, there's really 2 angles you have to look at it from, which is what are they doing in sport and what is their anatomy.
All right. Now, when it comes to unilateral and bilateral loading, what's the typical percentage, would you say, conventional programs that you would find outside of professional sports are going to be very heavily biased toward bilateral movements, and the unilaterals are just now starting to come on a little bit more, like single leg deadlifts, split squats, the rear leg raise, and so on. But where do you see the programming be? Are you more heavily on unilateral loading compared to bilateral?
I would say I'm not biased towards either. I'm sure I am. I'm biased towards everything, but if you want higher force production, you need a more stable surface, and that is a bilateral exercise. If you want motor control, pelvic control, postural control in positions that are going to directly translate to sprinting, then we're talking about a difference between a software and a hardware issue. And the software components are probably better trained unilaterally, especially when we get into the conversation about cross crawl patterning and how humans actually learn to move.
I love it. Yeah, I hadn't thought of the software hardware analogy. I kind of like that. All right. So when it comes to overusage, obviously, Little League Baseball is rampant right now with Tommy John surgery. You see it in the news with 12-year-olds going under the knife and so on. How is it that the Astros organization is helping to reduce injuries of your players? And of course, that's a very general statement, and we're talking about individuals. I get it. But do you guys, do you tally throw counts, pitch counts? I mean, how much do you get into that when it comes to the paid athletes?
Yeah, so pitch counts and throwing programs are used across Major League Baseball, and that involves the ramp up from off season into spring training, and then it's going to be different for starting pitchers that have to throw a higher volume of pitches versus relievers. They're going to throw a lot fewer pitches, typically coming out of the gates, throwing gas, throwing as hard as they can. So there is a large component of that. I think the trick since my time here, just an observation, also looking back retrospectively at what has happened during different phases of extended off seasons in sports. So you look at NFL lockout times, combined with COVID baseball times, et cetera, injury rates tend to go up following those times. And I think that just lends itself to the obvious that even in a normal off-season scenario, the consistent auditing of what those off-season programs look like and the efficacy of the ramp-ups into season play a huge role in injury prevention, and you have to look at those things annually.
So do the numbers change then? Because, I mean, somebody threw out a pitch count ideal and said this is the threshold to go over, but that was based on one particular year. So are you telling me that pitch count numbers are going to vary from year to year based on the goings on in and outside of the clubhouse?
In a perfect world, the answer would be yes, but the reality is that you still have about the same amount of time in spring training to prepare people to hit the same level of performance once the season starts, and you are limited on roster size. So you can't just, say we're going to prepare our pitchers to throw half the pitches that we did previously and just double down the amount of pitchers that we have on the roster. It doesn't work that way. So it's an imperfect system that will always require, I think, constant attention.
Yeah, almost sounds like you got one hand tied behind the back and the other one's throwing pennies into the wishing well, hoping good things go right. But okay, so let's bring in assessments, because you keep coming back to it really depends upon the individual, which I wholeheartedly agree with, because any program is the wrong program in the wrong hands. So how is it that you assess the players, or your staff assesses the players? And hopefully you're going to say, well, it's an ongoing assessment and every movement's an assessment, but what is the protocol that you typically use when assessing players to know what programs, what selection of exercises they should be doing, and volume and so on?
Yeah, so part of the answer to that gets into the sports technology that we use, which I can't really touch on as per club regulations. But even the approach that I took with USA Field Hockey, the athlete monitoring program, or the performance monitoring program, it was built into our training schedule. And I think that's generally how it should be done across the board. We're getting in sports as a whole, as technology has continued to become more accessible to all levels of sport. People are finding ways to integrate their performance testing as part of their daily programs. I'll give you an example. When I was at USA Field Hockey, every Monday morning, we would do a speed session, and every third week of that speed session, we would test a 10 and 20 yard sprint time, so that we can look at our acceleration capabilities, and we do that all year long. So I never had to taper down or get the coach to taper field hockey practice down so that I could ramp up one portion of S&C just for the sake of testing it. In sports with prolonged seasons, the goal is not peak performance for every game. The goal is a high level of performance for every game. And then if we do our job as strength and conditioning coaches, developing the qualities that underpin skill, and also keeping players healthy enough to be available to practice their skill, then peaking naturally happens at the end of the season.
I like that. So you used the sprints as one of your barometers, and you had it basically over the course of time, somewhat of a longitudinal study, so you could see, based on the performance of the sprints alone, whether they were so-called in the training zone, or their sympathetic parasympathetic was kind of balanced out, and they weren't in a hyper state or hypo state, and you knew exactly the volume of work they could do. Is that where you're kind of getting at there too?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, adaptation is not linear, so that became a huge educational component with the athletes. What are we trying to achieve throughout this training cycle? What do we expect is going to happen? Maybe certain aspects of performance drop off for a little bit at the expense of improving others. And yes, if your performance monitoring is integrated on a frequent enough basis, it can also become your fatigue monitoring at the same time. The last thing that I want to do is start compiling more and more tests that are not going to be digestible by our staff because we just don't have time. B, it might reduce the quality of coaching because we're collecting too much information. Or C, we can't even give feedback to the athletes or make programming changes based off of that. Athletes certainly don't want to be treated like guinea pigs. And so it's important that anything that you test provides feedback. And when you get that level of feedback and the level of education, now you reach a level of autonomy.
Sure. So before the show, you were mentioning you went to school and a couple of your professors were Gray Cook and Lee Burton, who amongst Dr. Greg Rose came up with the functional movement screen. So is that, in terms of movement screening, which that one is the most popular these days, but is that something more toward the athletic trainers, physical therapists, and you kind of just let them run with that, and not necessarily the strength coaches? Like you say, you don't want to be stopping and testing everybody. Is that kind of the protocol or the formula you guys use?
Yeah, so that particular screen was basically designed to allow somebody to introduce their body and their movement to me within a 10-minute window. When
Sure.
you've got 250 athletes, that 10-minute window becomes really, really long. So we allow our athletic trainers, or I shouldn't say allow, our athletic trainers, they do much more in-depth musculoskeletal exams on our players on a regular basis. I would imagine, I mean, I haven't been here very long, but I would imagine that at some point everybody's going to go through that training room, whether God forbid it's an injury, but also players need some TLC throughout the year. Stay loose, reduce inflammation, things like that. And so our ATs are in an ongoing process of checking and rechecking how somebody moves. And again, part of the thing that we have to look at is the acute biomechanical changes that happen after a pitcher goes out and throws a bullpen or throws a live. So those screening tools, if not done frequently enough, may not be able to provide all the answers you need to guide your programming throughout the year.
And what are some of the biggest challenges coming for you in your position for this season? What do you see them being right now?
Developing congruency throughout the organization as far as the implementation of our programming, what our methodology is. Dan Howells was in my position before me, and he did a really good job of setting that foundation. And I'm trying to just expand upon that. But with having several of my staff members in locations spread out across the U.S., the communication piece is a big challenge. We, just like our players that we want to develop in season, we want our staff further developing in season, and it's my job to facilitate that. And yeah, I think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges while guys are traveling to 142 to 162 games a year.
And with the other disciplines of, say, nutrition, director of sports performance, athletic trainers, physical therapists, you're obviously coordinating with the entire team, and you're probably spending half your time in meetings. So first of all, thanks for sitting in another meeting with me. But how does that work with all the other teams? I imagine there's a hierarchy, and you meet with the head athletic trainers, physical therapists, and so on, and they filter down to the other teams and organizations within the organization, just like you do with the strength conditioning. Is that accurate?
Yes, but myself and the organization, we try to promote a pretty flat hierarchy. There's no circumstance where any one of our S&C coaches can't go meet with the head of sports science or the head athletic trainer. We want our staff interacting constantly. And ultimately, that's what's going to drive thought sharing and innovation. And at the end of the day, everything revolves around providing the best outcomes for the athletes. And that doesn't happen with macro communication. That has to happen with face-to-face conversations constantly.
Gotcha. Wow. Now you mentioned innovations, and I kind of have to scratch my head and go, okay, what's coming down the pipe? And I know there's not a whole bunch of things you can share because you want the competitive edge over the other team. So I get that, right? So I'm not going to put you in the hot seat there, but like, if there was something that has been tickling your fancy without giving too much away, is there something in regards to innovation or concepts that you're kind of like, oh, I find that intriguing. These other teams are doing that. I wouldn't mind kind of looking into that.
Well, my answer might not impress you here, but if you look at the way the Game Boy was invented, and at the time there was other color Game Boys or similar devices already out, the Game Boy basically used technology that was already available, and we know when technology is already available, it's already outdated. But they created a very user-friendly model that basically crushed all of the competition, and I still have my original Game Boy today. That is the way that I try to spend most of my time thinking when it comes to innovation. Look at the technology and the processes that we already have in place and find what the low-hanging fruit is. I can say, I believe that nutrition has a far greater impact than people either understand or choose to devote their time and effort to. And I think when it comes to injury prevention and performance, both physical and cognitive, that nutrition, an organization that's going to implement nutrition on the most effective, widespread level is a team that's going to see a lot of enhanced success. I think endocrine responses to training are also not considered as often. A lot of the strength and conditioning conversations we tend to have are around force output, power output. But if we're looking at pituitary response, adrenal response, two different forms of training, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there as well, that may actually change the way we view our programming.
I'm glad you bring that up. I mean, endocrinology put aside for the time being, because I don't have enough insight on that, and you can probably teach me quite a few things about it. But in regards to nutrition, there is a disconnect within the industry of strength conditioning. And I don't know why, but it seems that, granted, there's going to be some strength conditioning coaches that know a hell of a lot about nutrition, but that's not part of our educational background. It's not, it's maybe a very small fraction of most exams when it comes to that. And when you're in school, it's almost like when you're going for your bachelor or master's in exercise science, nutrition is almost like an elective. So I would love for that to change. And it sounds like you're bringing that in there, because yeah, if I put really crappy gas into my car, it's not going to perform that well compared to if I put some really nice high octane stuff in there, and that thing's going to be like a rocket. So it's very interesting you're bringing this in. So how is it that you guys are working with nutritionists? Because everybody has eating plans, I imagine. That's at least the major leagues, right?
So we have a full-time dietitian at the major league level, and I'm going to get this so wrong. It's either an apprentice or a part-time dietitian at the AAA level. It has not been filtered out entirely through our organization yet, but they work with our whole organization. Putting together educational resources, working with the S&C staff to further push out those kinds of things. If we look at an environmental factor that we can't typically control for, which is what happens when players go home to their home countries and different food accessibility is not there, or simply the choices that are put in front of them are vastly different than what we would choose to curate in a high performance environment. Bringing changes to those aspects in any way that we possibly can, and maintaining communication throughout the off season is going to be a critical factor in long-term performance development.
Fantastic. Yeah, I can only see that. That is the next frontier in terms of sports performance, is the actual fueling, proper fueling. Well, Nick, this has been fantastic. This hour's flown by. There's some where they creep by, but this was not one of them. You gave me so much insight and information, and without revealing, the little man behind the curtain. So I really appreciate that, and I'm sure the higher ups will say the same thing. And I'll root for the Astros just because I know you now, and I hope you have yourself a great season. Though my Bo Sox are doing pretty well up in the East Coast there. And hopefully you guys will meet in the playoffs, and then we'll have to get you back on, and we'll do a little or something like that. But man, you got yourself a full-on season schedule, more than I had ever imagined. So I hope you can keep your head on straight, and you stay in the right direction. And I really appreciate you coming on the Zelos podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been an honor, and I've listened to a lot of the other podcasts that you've done and the other guests that have been on here. I've really enjoyed the content so far, and appreciate you reaching out and asking me to sit down and talk. It's been great.
Well, man, you just raised the bar for everyone following you. That's all I can say. Thank you so much.
And that's it for another episode of the Zelos podcast. Thank you, Nick Shed, and the rest of the Houston Astros organization. Also want to thank Perform Better for being our sponsors. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Rocky_Snyder, and we'll just see you next week.